Okay, so here we are for lecture 3 on the topic of sex and gender. And I realize I'm not moving very quickly. Okay, so we left off and I was talking about a bunch of all terms, and we moved into the topic of gender roles. Gender roles, as I've indicated, are simply patterns of behavior that get assigned to people based on their assumed or their identified gender. So you have gender role stereotypes, and in another chapter we'll talk about, the stereotypes are cognitive shortcuts and their ways of summarizing information. But basically, it's the danger or the risk, the bad part about stereotypes are when they get used to limit people. So, or when we draw overreaching assumptions. So, a classic example is that women are good at cooking and that men watch a lot of sports. And I experience one of these consequences, and I like to do, or my husband and I used to do service work with our church, and it was always assumed that I knew how to cook, right? Because I was a woman. And in fact, in my house, I do very little cooking. My husband prefers to cook, but this would limit then my interaction, because when I would go to on these trips, I was immediately assigned the kitchen, even though, and then if I didn't have good cooking skills, and I can make myself food, but I certainly don't have skills to make fresh bread. But when I couldn't do those things, then, well, what's wrong with you? Or I would become socially marginalized. That's the risk of, or another one might be like games, video games. If a man or a young man isn't involved or interested in video games, well, then he's not incorporated into the group, because the group of other male friends, because it's the assumption that, it's the norm. It's the, well, then you're not one of us, kind of thing. Anyway, and so you've got a couple interesting videos I think I've assigned for you to watch when about how ridiculous some of these are, and we only really notice them when they're flipped around. So in a couple of these are they're getting kind of old now, but in a couple of these, when you put men in these traditional female presentations, it kind of becomes kind of ridiculous. And then benevolent sexism. So all the isms, right? These isms, sexism, racism, classism, all the isms are ways of making people of a certain group less than. So it's only an ism when it treats a group as less than. So sexism is when we treat or regard women or men as being less than. Benevolent implies that this is like, well, it's really good for you. So good for you sexism would be a kind of sexism that assumes that women are weak and they must be protected by men. Or another one might be that men are incapable of, preparing meals for themselves and taking care of children, so let me do that for you. And in that way, it's derogatory and judgmental and kind of hostile towards that group, but it's done in a way of, being kind, and I know you're not capable of doing the laundry, or, well, except that wouldn't be a really good example, but when we say that women aren't shouldn't be allowed, say, to fight in combat because they're simply not strong enough, right? That's an example of benevolent sexism. I mean, there are women that are stronger than men, and in that case, that woman would make a better soldier than that man, right? But we're not denying it based on sex or based on gender. Okay, I think that hopefully that makes a point. Stratification. This is a very important, I'm going to move my little thing down here. This is a very important idea and what we mean by stratification. So if you took a class, maybe if you've ever taken a geography class or an earth science class where they talk about how rocks are stratified and how we have what's called a stratosphere, how the atmosphere, right? We called it this, which is the atmosphere. So stratification implies layering, right? Social stratification implies layering of groups of people. Oh, you should have gotten this introduction in the global stratification chapter, right? Where we were talking about stratification based on wealth or economic or resources. When we talk about gender is another example of stratification, where men are at the top of the pile and women are lower than men. But then when you start throwing in like maybe agendered people or intersex people or trans people, they even have less social status than do women, right? So again, I kind of talked about this on a previous slide. The issue is not that men and women are different, right? I have been accused in previous, in early in my career of suggesting that everybody should be the same. That's not what sociologists are suggesting. We're not suggesting everybody the same, but we are suggesting that everyone gets equal worth, right? That we recognize those people who are out in the workforce making money, but we also recognize the people that are at home tending to the home. Or a great example are childcare workers, right? Childcare workers are some of our lowest paid workers in the economy. They're overwhelmingly female, but yet if we don't have childcare workers, the electricians and the construction workers and the CEOs can't go to work. So why are they not treated with more? Why are their wages not higher or treated better? Because they, in fact, enable those high paid, you know, traditionally masculine workers to go to work. In some cultures, for instance, I'm way getting ahead of myself, but there is a group of a group of economists that argue that we should be compensating women. We should be compensating anyone who stays at home and takes care of the children at at a livable wage, because when someone is at home tending to the home, preparing the meals, doing the laundry, taking care of the children, they are enabling the wage earner to go out into the work and into the world and make money. Then when that wage earner comes home and their home is tended, their laundry is done, their meals are prepared, their children are tended to, they can recoup so that they're better equipped to go out and be more productive in the labor force. If you were to hire somebody to do all of the tasks that a stay-at-home parent does, or a stay-at-home parent does, I've seen some of the statistics, but imagine, if you were to pay a cook and a housekeeper and a child care worker. The point is that that's sort of the point, is that tasks that get assigned, feminine tasks, are typically less valued in our culture. Great examples are, our childcare, housekeeping, women in sports, right? That kind of thing. Okay. Um, Anthropologists argue that this is a cultural universal, that all over the world we stratify by gender, but the lower ranking status of women is not universal. There are a handful of groups that appear that women soldiers or women warriors were actually elevated in some groups. And there's an interesting anthropological argument that says that in societies that did not understand the relationship between men and women in terms of reproduction, women had more social status. So in other words, when women would just spontaneously grow big and and a baby would come, then she was held to a higher status. But once it was understood that it required a man to do something to that woman before she got pregnant, then her relative rank was lower. Sex typing simply refers to occupations that get assigned to one sex or the other. We were talking gender socialization. One of the assignments or actually two of the assignments in this chapter are about gender socialization. How do we learn to become male or to take on those gendered ways of being, those feminine ways of being? The one example has you or invites you to go to a toy department and look at the toys, right? Look at which toys appear to be marketed to little girls, which appear to be marketed to boys. What do those toys say about how boys and girls are supposed to be, how they're supposed to interact? And the other one has you picking a couple television shows. And instead of looking at like socialization, look at the way these television shows depict women and men and white people and people of color, right? Who seems to be running the show, right? Who seems to be running society? What does it say about the way men and women are supposed to interact, right? So you get to choose. You don't have to do both. Choose one or the other. Some of the consequences, we've already talked about some of the consequences already. Certainly pay, right? The gender wage gap. You can click on this link and see about some of the um, how that bears out, and you'll notice that certain states there's less of a gap between male and female wages. Women in politics, right? We all over the world, the political game is run by women. Reproductive legislation. So what this point is really about, and I actually don't know if that link still works anymore, but the point that feminists and sociologists and gender scholars um, make is that because the politics and the reproductive legislation, they sort of go together. The fact that there are so many, that there's a disproportionate number of male policymakers, and that one very popular area of legislation is reproductive, and those reproductive laws apply to women's bodies, but they're not being made by women, and there is something on the order of 100 to 1. Actually, I can't think of a single legislative item that had implications for a man's reproduction. It's all reproductive legislation is over what a woman can do with her body or to her body. There are no similar policies about what a man does to his body or can be done to his body. Right? So reproductive legislation is targets women's bodies, but it's made by men. It's a private thing, but it gets decided in the world of politics and public arena. And then you're also asked to watch this short video about gender-based pricing, and that simply draws attention to how same things, when it's in a male packaging or if it's for men, the wage it costs less. Classic ones, haircuts, right? A man's haircut costs less than a woman's haircut. They've done some investigation with investigative journalism, right, with dry cleaners, that if it's a blouse, it costs more. If it's a man's shirt, it costs less. And this is all completely legal in most states. I think there's a couple states where it's not legal. Okay, I've gone over my 10 minutes, so I'm going to stop right here. And when we, in the next one, I'll kind of talk more about what I've already said.